Okay, so no one is actually here for this panel, but being that I was planning on putting it up anyways later as a podcast, I may as well just do it and record it now. So hello to all 0 of you turning in for this Faction Paradox panel. This is actually the most fitting way for this panel to have gone. Faction Paradox has always been the black sheep of the Doctor Who spinoff family. No one's really paid a lot of attention to it, and when people have, it's never really gone that well for Faction Paradox. Not a lot of people know this, and this is cutting a little bit ahead in the history, but there was at one point a talk of a Faction Paradox movie, and, as you know, there isn't one, so we'll get to that in a little bit. So what is Faction Paradox? Well, Faction Paradox is a book series, audio drama series, and comic book series, briefly, that is based on a group of villains from the BBC 8th Doctor Adventure novel series. They were first mentioned in the 7th Doctor novels, where they just got like one name drop in a book called Christmas on a Rational Planet by Lawrence Miles, who created the entire thing. But they didn't really appear until the book Alien Bodies, which came out in 1997. As you might or might not know, this is the 20th anniversary of Faction Paradox. Yay! Yeah, it's pretty exciting. I'm happy about it. I can see that every single person in this audience is as happy about it as me. So that's pretty cool. There's, 100% excitement in this room, and honestly, that's enthralling. So, on this 20th anniversary of Faction Paradox, it's still going. And it's still going because there are people who are extremely passionate about it, even though it's this really weird little obscure Doctor Who spinoff that not many people really know or care about. But the people who do care about it have cared about it enough that it's still here. So that first book, Alien Bodies, was considered one of the best 8th Doctor books that came out. People really, really liked it. And if you ever get the chance to read it, sadly it's out of print. So unfortunately, the only ways to really get a hold of a copy of it without spending a lot of money aren't, particularly legitimate. But it's a great book, and it really deserves the praise it got. It's one of those books that clearly set up quite a bit about the future of Doctor Who. People later on pulled from the ideas that Lawrence Miles had in starting the Doctor Who show. And they did this for all of the Doctor Who expanded universe works that were made between the cancellation of the show in the 80s and when it came back. So it's not like this is like some super, specific, carefully plotting thing. There is a little tendency in the Faction Paradox fandom for some people to go, oh, everyone stole everything Lawrence Miles made. The Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat are secretly plotting to reuse every idea he had. No. I mean, they were pulling from everything that people came up with during the gap between the show's cancellation and when it came back, because they wanted to make the best show there was, and so they used all the best ideas they could, and Lawrence Miles came up with some good ideas in Alien Bodies. So, that book was a success, and the ideas he came up with in it started to be expanded to other books. So in this book, he introduces Faction Paradox, who are a group of time-traveling voodoo cultists who used to be one of the great houses of Gallifrey. So they were one of the, big people there, but their founder, who is called Grandfather Paradox, just rejected everything about Gallifrey society. He got pissed off, he cut his own arm off, and severed his shadow from his body, and then he just kind of said, hey guys, peace, I'm out, and started his time-traveling voodoo cult. But the thing about him is he may or may not ever existed, because he also kind of removed himself from history as well. So Faction Paradox is itself a paradox. That's kind of the point. Their whole existence is basically a giant insult to Gallifrey. So the world the Doctor came from, in these spin-off books, there aren't children, families are not a thing that happens, and so the Faction Paradox, they model their whole society off of a family. Also, the Time Lords look down on people who aren't Time Lords, so Faction Paradox adopts everybody who they want into the group who isn't a Time Lord. So there are a lot of humans and other alien species who are a part of Faction Paradox. And they're all accepted and used as agents to go through time and mess things up. So in Alien Bodies, their Faction Paradox encounters the Doctor because the Doctor has died in the future. Sometime way away, he has died and they have his body, and they're trying to auction his body off. And the Doctor learns he died in some sort of great war. They call it the War in Heaven. And it's a war, dun dun dun, through time. Almost like a time war. Anyways, so things, go their usual way of how they would in any sort of Doctor Who adventure. And, the Doctor defeats the bad guys and things go on. But this future war is kind of left hanging. And so naturally, it continues on in the next few books. Lawrence Miles himself wrote a 2-part novel called Interference, book 1 and 2, which delve into things. But then there was also Unnatural History by Jonathan Bloom and Kate Orman, The Blue Angel, The Taking of Planet 5 by Simon Booker-Jones and Mark Clapham, Shadows of Avalon, and finally, so things started to go a little bit downhill here in a few ways. So Lawrence Miles loves Doctor Who, but he's kind of a curmudgeon in a lot of ways. He kind of got on a lot of people's nerves, per se. So by the end of his time on the Doctor Who books run, people were kind of done with him. His books had sold well, but as anyone working in the creative arts knows, if you're not getting along with the people you're working with, people aren't going to work with you again for the most part, unless you're, making bazillions of dollars. So, they decided that he was basically done and that they were going to end off all the plot lines he'd started up with his whole future war. And they did it in a book called The Ancestor Cell, which was written by Stephen Cole and Peter Angladees. So they wrote this book that finishes off all these plot lines in the year 2000, and it does it, but they did it without consulting Lawrence Miles at all, so it's a little bit funky. The end of their story kind of goes against a lot of what had previously been set up with Faction Paradox, and it reduces a lot of the things down to kind of more simplistic answers than it looks like things were leading towards. Some people like it. Personally, I'm not that much of a fan, but people liked Faction Paradox enough and they were cool enough ideas that Lawrence Miles decided he was going to spin it off. So he did. It started with the BBV audio series. BBV, which is a play on BBC, it was Bill and Bag's Video, and they did a bunch of Doctor Who spin-off videos that they released in the 90s. They would buy the rights to like one character or a monster from Doctor Who and hire some old actors and actresses, and they would, just start making something off of that. Hello?
Hi, I'm just checking out the room.
You have a panel in here later?
Tomorrow.
Gotcha.
Do you?
I have a panel right now, but as you see, no one's here, so I'm just kind of recording it anyways, since I'm going to pop it up as a podcast, I guess, since I'm here.
Yeah.
Yeah. A little disappointing, but there you go.
So early.
Yeah.
Wow, I'm sorry about that, man.
Yeah.
What's the name of your podcast?
Well, I'm not sure. I'll just probably try to get it on one of a feed of some people I know who just do general media podcasts. I do other podcasts, but they're not like focused on this. So,
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. What's your panel?
It's my podcast is called Wedley Radio. It's tomorrow night at 5. I don't know what the hell anything is in here.
No, that's cool.
Yeah.
Well, good luck.
All right. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so where was I? So somebody just came in and, well, they have a panel here tomorrow. But, yeah. Okay, so where was I? Yeah. Oh, yeah, BBV. So Lawrence Miles was like, hey, let's spin this off. So he did. And they did 6 audio plays. Starting with one called The 11-Day Empire and going all the way towards one called A Labyrinth of Histories. And these went from 2001 to 2004, this series of audio dramas. And they were interesting. So Lawrence Miles wrote the scripts to all of them, and they immediately begin fleshing out and expanding the universe of Faction Paradox. But at the same time, they start everything off by tearing the mythology down at the same time it's being introduced. So the 11-Day Empire is about the homeworld of Faction Paradox. They bought, and this is a funny little nod to history, during a calendar adjustment, one of the kings of England had to remove 11 days from the calendar. And so there was this time where they just had to leap forward 11 days. Faction Paradox bought those 11 days, and they live in those 11 days, which they have bought and separated out from the rest of time in London, where they keep their headquarters. And so it's just called the 11-Day Empire. So it starts off introducing this thing, and then it gets invaded by Sontarans, and it falls, and the main characters have to leave. And it's barely even a spoiler, because it happens so quickly. And this is very common with Faction Paradox. It's one of the things that's made it both the thing that has kept people's rapt attention and fascination, and yet also the thing that's made it rampantly inaccessible at the same time, is that Faction Paradox, from its inception and all the way through, has an extremely dense, well-thought-out mythology. And it cares nothing about ripping it apart, spitting it out just to tell the story that it's going to tell. And this happens over and over, and it's great and also very strange because, as I'm sure you're familiar with, most media properties, when they kill off a major element, they play it off as a pretty big deal. They want to be able to milk something that they've introduced for as long as they can. With Faction Paradox, that's really, really not the case. Things pop in and pop out just with incredible frequency, and it's all just to tell really neat little sci-fi stories. And those stories are better for it, but it also means that these stories are not something that is as easily monetizable as other kinds of stories. So those 6 audio dramas ended, and in between them, they went from 2001 to 2004. In 2002, Mad Norwegian Press started releasing Faction Paradox novels. So the first one was called The Book of the War, and it was written by a whole ton of writers and edited by Lawrence Miles, and it tells the complete story of his war in heaven. Like the complete story from like beginning all the way to like things being completely obliterated and falling. And it's fascinating because it's a book that, like I was just talking about, it sets up the whole world at the same time as it tells you how everything's gonna go to heck at the end of it. Crazy, right? So now that we've begun, we go on. Lawrence Miles writes a novel called This Town Will Never Let Us Go, and it may or may not feature Faction Paradox in it at all. There's certainly references to it and lots of characters who might be part of Faction Paradox, but who knows, really? They also re-released a earlier novel that Lawrence Miles wrote called Dead Romance, which was republished as a Faction Paradox novel, but had previously been part of a line of books called The Virgin New Adventures, which had been Doctor Who books that Virgin had the Doctor Who license, and after they lost it, they released some books based on characters that they owned the rights to, who had been in the Doctor Who novels, but they didn't connect them to Doctor Who anymore and only used original elements that they owned. And this had been one of those. Mad Norwegian got the rights and popped that out. So they went through, they released a bunch more novels, but most of them were only kind of tentatively tied to the larger mythology of Faction Paradox. Most of them were really good individual sci-fi stories that didn't feature any of the main characters we'd been introduced to, or if they did, it was fleeting, coming in and out. And this has kind of been the big setup for how books have continued all the way through and down. The Mad Norwegian Press line of Faction Paradox books is very good, but if you're going into it expecting like a big overarching narrative to go through them, kind of like often happens with, say, Del Rey Star Wars books, you're gonna be a little disappointed because that's not what they're trying to do. In between all of that, still, there's one more thing that happened. There were Faction Paradox comics released by Image Comics in collaboration with Mad Norwegian Press. Now, this didn't go that well. They only got to make 2 issues. Now, for all of the thousands of you out there in the audience, if you look up, you can see that I have the cover that was going to be the 3rd issue cover for the comic. They didn't even get to finish the first arc, which would have been 4 issues. So it's the story of the Faction Paradox comics has never been finished, but it's also yet another example of how it just defies everything you'd expect it to do. Because the Faction Paradox comics take place after the end of the big war, which is the main plot of it. Yeah, it's all over, and it's about 2 members of the faction who have survived and are apparently the only members of the faction left. It does what it wants. So we go on, and after that failed, sadly, we have the Magic Bullet audios. Now, Magic Bullet had previously released an audio series called Caldor City, which was based on a Doctor Who story and used its setting. It was a Doctor Who story that was aired on TV. And they released a big 6-part audio series. It featured famous actors like Julian Glover, and it was very well done. But it also has a completely different cast than the audio dramas by BBV, but it features the same characters. So the main 2 characters from the audio dramas before are now recast in these new dramas and have completely different accents. They sound nothing alike. Absolutely nothing alike. It's amazing. So that's weird. But, the thing is that they're better produced and better written, so you kind of get over it pretty quickly. It deals a lot with the Osirians, who are from Doctor Who television again. They were licensed out. They're basically the Egyptian gods, but they're aliens. And it goes through a big plot line with them and dealing with stuff with the war. And by the end of it, they've wrecked a whole bunch of stuff from the mythology yet again. And I mean, it's a good story, and all these audio dramas are very much worth listening to, though if you want to listen to the second set, you should really listen to the first set, even though the voices are completely different. The story and the characters do carry over from them, so it's worth listening to all 12. So after that, a different publisher got the license to release Faction Paradox novels. This company was called Random Static, and they released one novel in 2008 called Newton's Sleep. And then they were done, and they didn't do anything else with it, and that was that. So all of these things had ended. So what was next at this point? Well, we have Obverse Books enter the frame. So Obverse Books got the license to release new Faction Paradox books in 2010, and they started by releasing a book called Romance in 12 Parts, which is a short story collection, and that came out in 2011, and they've been releasing books ever since, and they've been doing a fantastic job. If you've heard of Faction Paradox, probably it's because of Obverse Books. They're the ones who have kept it alive, and they've really taken to heart what the Faction Paradox series is, which is a excuse to tell amazing sci-fi stories under a shared banner with a shared universe that writers can build from instead of having to just come up with, their own convoluted sci-fi backstory and introduce it to readers over and over again. Instead, you have all these novels where once you understand the base universe, so basically all you have to do is read, the Book of the War, you can jump into any of these other books, you know everything you have to know, and it tells an amazing story that can either build off of things in the mythology or just ignore most of it and just know that those things are there supporting all of the rest of the story that you have. For the 20th anniversary, they've been releasing some great books. Weapons Grade Snake Oil came out this year, as well as another novel called Spinning Jenny. And later this month, there's going to be a novel, it's a collection of short stories like the Book of the War, called the Book of the Peace. So that's exciting. I'm pretty excited for that book. It's going to be a new beginning and a great place to jump on, I think, even though I haven't read it, just from the title and what it means for the series, a great place to jump on for the next 20 years of Faction Paradox stories. This is going to be something that's going to take us into the future of the series rather than, just continuing on in the past that it's had. And that's exciting, and I'm excited for it. So Faction Paradox as a series has had kind of a rough history. The Faction Paradox series at one point got as far as Lawrence Miles getting to make a pitch for a Faction Paradox movie. And when he tried to explain the premise of Faction Paradox, he pitched it as something meets Amadeus, and the producer just hung up on him, which is very accurate, but kind of incredible. I mean, how else are you supposed to explain a time-traveling voodoo cult series of books to people? And there's all sorts of crazy stuff in these books that would make, amazing stuff visually for a movie. Characters who join the faction get their shadows cut off of them, and they get a new shadow, which kind of like Peter Pan's shadow can take different shapes. And also, their shadow has a weapon that it holds. And so their shadow's weapon, they can use that to attack people without actually having a weapon in their hand, but their shadow has one. And that's pretty darn cool. They also wear skull masks everywhere, which is why I have this skull up here, which I borrowed from Brie Pie Art. Thanks, Brie. But at the same time, it is absolutely fitting that it wouldn't get anywhere. Like, Faction Paradox was described by writer Phil Sandifer as the furthest you can get from Doctor Who while still being Doctor Who. And, well, I think that's probably not entirely true, because I think you could probably go a little bit further, since Faction Paradox has its own spin-offs, which I'll talk about in a second here. It's pretty accurate, because Faction Paradox is very clearly placed in the bones of Doctor Who. Doctor Who runs in its blood, and even though Faction Paradox is kind of edgy and sometimes tries a little bit too hard to be like adults and that sort of thing, it's still got some of that Doctor Who magic, and Obverse has been doing a great job with that. Andrew Hickey's novel Head of State, which came out pretty recently, back in 2015, that novel is a fantastic riff on a Doctor Who story in a lot of ways. It's told through found documents. Basically has 3 different things where you're reading an account by Lawrence Burton, the adventurer, in the real world, who is detailing his quest, and then there is a lost story from the 1001 Arabian Nights, which may or may not be forged. And then there is a story from a journalist in the present day who is following an American presidential election. And the story could be a story that the Doctor could have come in to solve, but the story explicitly is kind of written around the idea of, what if someone removed the hero of a Doctor Who story from the story? How would everything go wrong? And it goes very wrong, and it's amazing. You also have Liberating Earth, which is a really, really cool anthology that Obverse put out, where every story is written by a woman and it's edited by a woman. And that's neat. It brought a lot of new voices into the series. Everyone working on it did an amazing job. It's one of the best things that Obverse has done, especially just in terms of how it's brought new voices into science fiction and amplified voices who were already there. It's definitely worth checking out. If nothing else, even if you read all of this and you're listening, you're like, Faction Paradox, go check out Liberating Earth, because it's good, and you don't need to know anything to go into it. It's very accessible, so you'll have a good time. So Obverse Books has also released some spin-offs to Faction Paradox. I know, right? They have the Tales of the City, which is all a spin-off to a book called a book by Philip Purser Howard called Of the City of the Saved, which is about a big city which exists between the end of our universe and the beginning of the universe that comes after ours, which is a secular heaven. It's a place where every single person who has ever died, who's a human, has been reborn into this giant city with, trillions of people on it. And it's pretty darn cool. It's a great setup, and as Obverse realized, it is big enough to, fit its own series, and it did. So the City of the Saved novels, or not novels, they're all short story collections. They explore the city and the people who live in it, and it's good stuff. There's also Senior 105, which is kind of a spin-off of both Faction Paradox and Iris Wildtime, who is a character by the great Paul Majors. She's kind of a alternate doctor who Paul Majors invented, and she has her own spin-offs also by Obverse, and her stories are a lot of fun too. She was a character that was, explicitly kind of like an reaction against the Doctor. She's much more chaotic, and it's she always claims that all of her stories are the original Doctor Who stories, and his stories are just copies of hers, and it's a lot of fun. So, Obverse has been creating this little kind of chunk of Doctor Who-ness, which is all its own and stands on its own outside of Doctor Who, while also still being something that I feel like will really enrich your experience of viewing Doctor Who. Because it has a lot of stories that take the premises of Doctor Who and do things with them that you couldn't do on TV. And that's really valuable and oftentimes has made for fantastic storytelling. So, it's the 20th anniversary of Faction Paradox. It's a series I'd love to write for. If you're familiar with me at all, I've written a Doctor Who poetry book and 2 sci-fi novels. And man, like it is definitely up there for me in the series I'd like to write for. And you should go read them because I love it. And if you love Doctor Who, it's 100% worth checking out. So I was going to leave a little time for questions here at the end. But that's not really going to be a thing, is it? So I guess I'm done. Woo! Yay! Awesome. All right, so I'm James Wilder. This has been the Faction Paradox 20th anniversary panel. And yeah, so thank you guys for taking a listen. I appreciate all of you who tuned in at home to hear this, despite me not actually getting to give this to a room of people in real life. And I'll try to put some links to Obverse stuff in the bottom here, so in the notes. So go check that out. Thank you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful, paradoxical year. All right, peace out. Love ya.